NATO's wake-up call. Can Europe survive without US troops? Picture this, it is 3 a.m. in Brussels, thunder rolling outside the Berlaymont, and the hotline to Washington rings into an unbroken dial tone. Donald Trump, returned to the Oval Office and campaigning on 5 little words, pay up or stand alone, has just warned that American troops might come home unless Europe spends 5% of its entire economic output on defense. Paris, Berlin and Warsaw are wide awake, asking the same questions you are. If 80,000 US soldiers leave the continent, can the European Union's patchwork of 27 armies click together fast enough to stop a Russian armored push through the Suwalki Gap? Could France really share its nuclear shield without pulling the political pin on German elections? How many welfare programs have to shrink so howitzers, tankers and stealth drones can expand? And after Brexit, would Britain's carriers sail under a European flag or steer their own course? Stay tuned. Over the next few minutes, we will follow the money, test the politics, and crunch the order of battle tables to discover whether Europe can defend itself, or whether the phrase, European Army, remains a phrase, and nothing more. This is Nexus-Feed Deep Dive. Let's get started. The shockwave began with a single paragraph buried in a State Department press briefing on the 13th of May, 2025. The new U.S. envoy to NATO confirmed that the administration would block the alliance's next communiqué unless every ally accepted 5% of gross domestic product as a permanent defense spending floor. Inside the secure corridors of the North Atlantic Council, the message landed like a depth charge. Estonia's foreign minister murmured that his country could perhaps stretch to the figure by 2029. Spain's delegate said bluntly that doubling its defense budget would gut public health care. But the real tremor followed a minute later, when an American colonel, speaking in the neutral tone reserved for bad news, outlined which units were on the bargaining table if negotiations stalled: the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vicenza, Italy, the 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Welsek, Germany, and supporting Patriot batteries from Roda to Ramstein. The implication was clear. If Europe would not bankroll its own security, America would stop underwriting it. So Europe's first response was to reach for the spreadsheets. On the surface, the numbers looked pretty reassuring. Around 1.47 million active-duty soldiers, once Britain is counted in, which is more than the 100,000-strong U.S. garrison. Defense spending of roughly $693 billion in 2024, the highest total since the Berlin Wall fell, and a fleet of new F-35s entering service from Denmark to Switzerland. But, if you dig a little deeper, the confidence kind of drains away. Those soldiers are scattered across about 36 command languages and 17 main battle tank designs. Maintenance backlogs really pinch readiness. For example, one German Panzer battalion recently reported that fewer than half its Leopard 2s could roll at short notice, because spare parts had been cannibalized to keep the rest alive. Air forces face similar headaches. 29 fighter variants mean 29 supply chains, 29 training syllabi, and a permanent headache for mission planners who need interoperable data links. Then, there are the so-called enablers. Generals love that word because it kind of hides the fact that without them, you really can't fight for more than a week. Europe owns only a fraction of the strategic air-to-air refueling tankers needed for sustained combat, relies on US satellites for about 90% of its real-time imagery, and has never fielded a theater-wide ballistic missile defense network of its own. So, if you strip away American contributions, a European air campaign would quickly shrink from a months-long sortie rhythm to just a handful of short, sharp raids. Dramatic for television, maybe, but strategically insufficient. The bright spot here is industry. Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine really scared European leaders into doing something they hadn't attempted in decades: collective rearmament. The EU's strategic compass, which was adopted in early 2022, set a pretty modest but symbolically important goal of a 5,000-strong rapid deployment force by 2027, and, crucially, established legal scaffolding that lets capitals pool orders without running afoul of the bloc's Byzantine state aid rules. Since then, Europe's defense industrial map has started to glow. Rheinmetall is pouring concrete for powder plants in Germany, Hungary, and Lithuania. France's Nexter and Italy's Leonardo are co-designing a 155mm shell that can be manufactured on both sides of the Alps without license wrangling. Even Finland's Nammo, which is famous for precision sniper ammunition, has broken ground on a factory in Sweden to quadruple artillery fuse production. By conservative estimates, Europe might turn out 2 million heavy-caliber rounds next year, which is about 10 times the pre-war baseline. Yet, the engineers delivering those numbers are really clear-eyed. A new TNT line isn't a light switch. It needs chemicals sourced from India or China, workers trained in hazardous processes, and inspections by regulators who are pretty allergic to risk after several deadly factory explosions in the 2010s. The fastest site still takes 2 to 4 years to hit full stride. Europe is sprinting, but it began the race halfway through the lap. With American patience wearing thin and factories humming at capacity, the old project of a European army has clawed its way back into mainstream debate. The concept actually predates the European Union itself. In 1950, just 5 years after the end of the war that flattened their cities, Paris floated the Pleven Plan to merge West German, French, Italian, and Benelux forces in a single uniform. The French National Assembly ended up killing it in 1954, fearful of losing sovereignty and, honestly, nervous about rearming Germans so soon after occupation. For half a century, the idea was resurrected only in academia or in the occasional flourish of a speechwriter's pen, but now it's on the lips of sitting ministers. A February 2025 paper by the Brussels-based Bruegel Institute ran the cold numbers. If American troops vanished tomorrow, Europe would need roughly 300,000 additional soldiers, about 50 modern combined arms brigades, to plug the holes, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. That force would demand fleets of C-17 class transport aircraft, KC-46 tankers, long-range surveillance drones, layers of missile defense, hardened logistics pipelines, and enough ammunition to sustain weeks of high-intensity fighting. Bruegel's bottom line: at least 120 billion euros a year above current budgets, and possibly 150 billion if inflation stays sticky. And, unlike pandemic stimulus checks, that money has to flow every year for decades. So, when you start talking about a continental army, the question of command just leaps immediately to the fore. Over the past year, there's been this informal caucus forming around 5 military heavyweights: France, Germany, Poland, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Diplomats have started calling them the E5. They basically cover the continent's only 2 nuclear deterrents, its largest defense budgets, and those key maritime choke points from the Norwegian Sea all the way down to the Sicilian Channel. Each one brings a pretty vital chip to the table. France, for example, has 290 nuclear warheads, blue water bases from Djibouti to New Caledonia, and Rafale squadrons that have been hardened by combat over the Sahel. Germany, on the other hand, wields the industrial and financial clout of Europe's biggest economy, and, since the Zeitenwende speech of 2022, a 100 billion euro modernization fund that has really restored credibility to a military once derided as non-deployable. Poland is now the fastest expanding land force on the continent, ordering American Abrams tanks and South Korean K-2 Black Panthers by the brigade. Italy commands a navy with 2 short takeoff F-35B carriers, one of the few naval assets that can project power quickly into North Africa. And Britain, though outside the EU, offers Trident submarines, a globally deployable carrier strike group, and the intelligence reach of the Five Eyes alliance. Since March, the E5 defense ministers have been meeting quarterly, issuing joint statements that, in careful language, read like the skeleton of a future strategic concept. Now, nuclear weapons really sit at the heart of any serious discussion about autonomous European defense, and honestly, this is where the politics gets pretty treacherous. The United States currently stations roughly 100 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs in Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Turkey, under a decades-old dual-key arrangement. If a second Trump administration were to pull those bombs, only France and Britain would remain as nuclear powers west of the river Bug. President Emmanuel Macron, interviewed on national television the night Washington's new demand broke, said he was ready to open the conversation about extended deterrence, even hinting that French nuclear-capable Rafales might one day rotate through bases in allied countries. Supporters in Warsaw and Tallinn see that as a possible umbrella, but, skeptics in Berlin ask whether French voters would ever trade Paris for Frankfurt if the chips were down. London, meanwhile, complicates the calculus. Since Brexit, Britain has kept one foot firmly in NATO and the other outside EU decision-making. Would it integrate its Trident force with a European army? A Downing Street advisor told the Financial Times off the record that any such move would require constitutional upheaval and a referendum likely to inflame partisan divides. Yet, even having that conversation marks a shift that, honestly, few imagined just 5 years ago. Even if weapons, headquarters, and treaties align, someone must pay, and voters must agree. The Financial Times crunched the numbers and concluded that a self-reliant European deterrent could swallow up to $387 billion annually, crowding schools, hospitals, and climate transition projects out of national budgets. For Germany, that could mean pushing overall public spending above levels last seen in the post-reunification splurge of the 1990s. For Italy, debt to GDP might pierce 170%. Meanwhile, constitutional lawyers warn of legal landmines. Germany's basic law, for instance, requires Bundestag approval for any combat deployment. Spain's constitution bars the stationing of foreign nuclear weapons. Ireland's neutrality clause complicates EU-wide command structures. The European army might therefore require parallel treaties, national referendums, or, at the very least, constitutional reinterpretations that courts have historically approached with extreme caution. Time, ultimately, is the dictator. Training a fighter pilot to NATO combat readiness takes a minimum of 5 years. Building a heavy-lift transport aircraft line from scratch, as Airbus executives remind every parliamentary hearing, takes closer to 7. Even if every European capital signed off a 3.5% defense budget tomorrow, the first genuinely independent corps-level formation would not be battle-ready before the early 2030s. Yet, Russia is not waiting. Moscow's deposits of oil money and sanctioned microchip smuggling routes are already fueling a rearmament plan, centered on mass-produced T-14 derivatives and cheaper hypersonic glide vehicles. Western intelligence estimates those will start emerging from factories in measurable numbers by 2028. The calendar, in other words, is not Europe's friend. Strategists therefore paint two diverging futures. In the darker one, domestic resistance caps defense spending below 3% of GDP. America's patience snaps. U.S. brigades sail home, and Europe fields only thin forward battalions backed by hope and diplomatic notes. In the brighter scenario, the E5 translates rhetoric into steel. Artillery lines churn out 2 million shells a year. Defense budgets converge on 3.5% of GDP, and by the end of the decade, a 3-division European corps stands watch from Narva to Constanta, supported but not dominated by U.S. forces. Which road Europe chooses will become visible, long before ground is broken on the first new tanker squadron. Watch the budgets, watch the factory permits, and above all, watch the polling numbers in the next national elections. Europe now stands at a post-war crossroads. It can double down on the transatlantic bargain and pray that U.S. politics remains favorable, or it can pay the full insurance premium and build the only force history suggests can guarantee European security, one owned, funded, and commanded by Europeans themselves. The bill is staggering, the constitutional engineering breathtakingly complex, and the politics, at times, toxic. Yet, the alternative may be a continent that discovers too late what deterrence truly costs. The next 18 months will reveal whether the idea of a European army marches from rhetoric to reality, or whether, when the hotline rings at 3 in the morning, Brussels will still be waiting for Washington to pick up. You've been watching Nexus-Feed Deep Dive. Subscribe to the channel as we chart every twist in Europe's race against the clock. Don't forget to add your voice in the comments section too. And until our next one, stay curious, stay critical, and keep safe.